Is Michael Lane. I'm the president of Liftport Group, and we've been hosting these podcasts as a service for, oh gosh, I guess it goes back to October last year. And normally it's a Monday, Wednesday schedule for our Dare Greatly program. Uh, but about 6 months ago, we brought on the Mars Society with their Red Planet Live show. And so they host that. We host that for them once a month. And now with our new client, the Space Frontier Foundation, we're hosting their Pioneers of Commercial Space, the Commercial Space Pioneers series. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and showcase that. With Red Planet Live, that's a live show with our Dare Greatly program. Also, that's a live show. Space Frontier Foundation chose to, mostly because of scheduling, chose to do this as a recording and then broadcast. But we're broadcasting at the same time we normally do. Mondays and Wednesdays are Dare Greatly show, and Tuesdays Commercial Space Pioneers series and Red Planet Live. All of these are 5 o'clock West Coast time, 8 o'clock East Coast time. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and fire this thing up. All right. Hope you all like it. I'm pretty excited about today.
The road to space isn't paved with technology and rockets alone. It's built on the dreams, risk, and relentless spirit of those who dare look up and say, "We belong there." For over 30 years, the Space Frontier Foundation has been a home for these visionary, radical, action-oriented individuals. Hear their stories, learn how space was shaped, and revel in the revolution of commercial space pioneers.
Lori, thanks so much for taking the time to share some of the stories that are very much related to the work that was done by the Space Frontier Foundation. If anyone's not already familiar with Lori, go read the book. Pause this, come back. That'll give you a fairly good idea about what Lori has already done. What I really love is to go maybe some of those things that are a step deeper, and what led up to some of the really crucial inflection points and decision points that you had and that you saw the industry having during that period. We're talking after L5 Society, after Moon Treaty, but still well before we got to the fulfillment of what currently exists in commercial space. Where, if we go backward in time, looking at kind of where things were in the late 80s, what time did you start getting some ideas that there was a different type of architecture that might work for space?
Sure. Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you. And I would say before the late 80s, in my own involvement began when I joined the National Space Institute as an entry-level staff person in 1984. And there was early discussion of a merger with this organization called the L5 Society at the time. And those discussions took 2 years. And while they were taking place, I was not involved in them at all. I was this receptionist, bookkeeper, secretary. That was the job I held in those early days. And the National Space Institute was founded in 1974 by Dr. Werner von Braun, a very tied to industry and hierarchical board structure. So for me, as you can imagine, this was just very early in my career out of college, that the L5 Society merger loomed large because it was going to be an influx of new people. And that's a fantastic thing. We only had 4 staff. They only had 3 staff. And so I was really excited about the merger. And hearing from the National Space Institute side what they wanted out of it, and then getting to know the L5 Society and recognizing we were going to be marrying the grassroots energy of L5 with hopefully the economic financial support of the industry was the concept. And my early memories of understanding beyond what just NASA was doing, which was what NSI supported, were from people like Gary Hudson, who I started going to international space development conferences in those years before even the merger. And I had a background in political science and economics. So a lot of this was to me the economic arguments of lowering the cost of space transportation and settling space. That was something that Gerard O'Neill had first written about, spoken about, taught, and all those early studies that were done made sense to me. And it was the L5 leadership who, just through getting to know them, it became clear to me that yes, they were passionate, but their views were also very well founded, and they made complete sense to me from the beginning. And what I couldn't really understand and started to question early was, why was this very small nonprofit organization the one driving these very thoughtful ideas when I'd gotten to know people very well at NASA. I played on the NASA softball team. It just wasn't something they embraced. These were shuttle years. These were people who felt flying, 6 to 7 shuttles a year was fantastic.
Do the thing. Yeah. So this is phenomenal. So you had the NSI direct experience, and then we're seeing this L5. And when you, as with that political and economic lens, how many counterparts did you feel that there were, like when you would show up at ISDC or some of these conferences? Were there other people that were taking that economic approach, or was it a lot more technical sort of discussions and thinking about great technical solutions?
One of the things about the L5 leadership that I think was brilliant was it was always married with the practical economic considerations, at least from the leadership that I worked most closely with. It wasn't just the technical. Yeah, there was very early talk of things like nanotechnology and the things like the space elevator that would ultimately really advance the time when there could be true spacefaring civilization, which ended up being something we used in our mission statement. But no, it was, and I credit Dr. O'Neill because that was part of their development as well. That really, and somewhat this idea of always being able to not test or strain the limited resources of Earth, but to tap those from beyond. That was always just, again, so sensible. Of course, it's long term. Of course. But what else was the space program really doing besides those practical economic things? Communication satellites were already a thing. GPS was starting. Remote sensing was starting. And human space flight was just these shuttles. And that was not going to create a spacefaring civilization very clearly.
Okay, so that's the space life at that time. What was your non-space life like, if there was any? I know, because space can kind of suck us in and become everything, but do you remember talking to friends outside the industry or family members and trying to explain this commercial appeal of space to people that weren't actually in the industry?
Well, that is a question I don't usually get asked. That's a great one, and it gets to a point I like to make, which is this really wasn't very controversial in the beginning.
It was
Like
not.
my father was a stockbroker. My family were farmers. They were in politics as Republicans in Michigan, farmers who were doing that, serving their neighbors. And so everything needed to be underpinned in sound policy that helped your taxpayer and expand the economic sphere. I doubt we called it that back then, but we really over time, I think it got more controversial later, maybe because people in the space industry started taking us seriously. But as I would convey, as a 20 something, to friends and family not in the space community, sort of this is our interest. I feel like it wasn't super controversial. Again, you are using logic to say transportation costs have to come down. And when they do, that opens up these new territories as they have here on Earth. And that's a new frontier. And, it was an exciting time in the beginning, when people thought the shuttle might be going as it was designed to, 52 times a year, once a week. It became clear to those of us paying attention that wasn't ever going to happen. But space is inherently interesting to people. And I don't feel I got a lot of pushback. I have looked back, especially researching the book, at testimony I made before Congress in the 80s and 90s. We had a policy committee, and much of what we said is what I ended up being able to start putting in place 30 years later. Unbelievable that it took that long. But these are things, again, that I believe became more controversial when they started really threatening existing ways of doing business. The truth is, in the 90s, we were doing the X-33 program. We had DCX. There were people focused on it. The head of NASA from 1992 to 2001, Dan Golden, was all aboard this. I took him to Space Frontier Foundation meetings. We had the Space Settlement Act in 1988. These are concepts. And again, driving my interest in writing the book was for people to understand this didn't start with SpaceX and Elon Musk. And frankly, none of that would have been successful without the early work of the L5 Society and the Space Frontier Foundation and people who've been tilling in those fields for decades. Of course, we needed SpaceX, and lots of companies and people had run at this and not been successful. But what I say in the book is we left the breadcrumbs, and it took SpaceX to follow them to start making it happen.
Do you think so? If it wasn't necessarily controversial, then there's some enthusiasm about space, because there's always enthusiasm about space. But was it not as difficult a task back then because it seemed like it was the logical thing? There are some people now that feel like work in space is doubly hard because there's the technical and then there's the business, or like working against a established machine that has high barriers. But at that time, like, if you could have predicted, when would you have said that there would be commercial companies providing access to space? Do you have any idea of what that guess might have been?
I think I would have guessed at least 10 years before that actually happened. I would have guessed by 2010, because we were really excited about the X-33 program.
Yeah.
You can look at any number of decisions along the way. You'd need a much longer program to do that, even just for this program alone, because a lot of folks feel that DCX, had it been selected, could have continued. But there was the overall global economy, not unlike the position we're in today, where when the sort of dot-com bubble burst in 2000, it killed the market pull of lowering the launch costs. Private industry didn't want to invest when there wasn't going to be these multiple constellations of hundreds of satellites. Now we have multiple constellations of thousands of satellites, and that is helping to drive launch costs down. Again, if you think about this economically, it makes sense, but we really thought we might get there through the X-33 program. Single stage, fully reusable to orbit in the 90s was just too big. Look, even Starship isn't a single stage.
Yep.
So Venture Star, Lockheed gets a lot of criticism. NASA gets criticism for having selected it. But I'll tell you what, we came closer than I think most people think. Had they chosen DCX again, it might have worked. X-33, when they blew the tank on that accident, I think it was 1999, we could have recovered that with not much investment. NASA was spending $8 billion. billion, and Lockheed was matching that. So since then, it's multiple billions for everything.
Oh, yeah.
If we would have just spent a couple hundred million more, we might have been on a path. Or if we had backed off and said, how about two stage? How about not single stage? Now, did the shuttle mafia come in and say, you know what? Let's literally bury this, because that's what they did with the Venture Star. They buried it in Palmdale because they didn't want it being resurrected again, which might tell you something. They liked their 4 to 5 billion a year in contracts to fly the shuttle a few times. Imagine that. And it wasn't until they had another accident that they stopped the battle to not have a replacement. But the real tragedy, there's so many, of not having anything set up to replace the shuttle. When I came into NASA a second time in 2008 and 9, those seeds were planted years before.
How did you, as someone who believed in a commercial, like the correct path rationally, economically, and maybe politically, was a commercial service, when these setbacks to that future started to impose themselves on your worldview, how did you grapple with that dose of, I don't know if it's even dose of reality, a dose of a set of situations that kind of would rock the foundation of your assumptions?
Well, I probably more often than any other question get, how did you keep going when it seemed like everyone was opposed, including, my boss, Charlie Bolden, the head of NASA, and so forth, industry, the Hill, I'm being maligned, I'm being criticized for ruining and trying to ruin the future of human spaceflight by Apollo astronauts and so forth. And the answer is the same as these decades earlier lessons that I had learned from the people who came before. I knew it was right. I knew it was correct. And so no amount of just delay was going to help. That was going to make it worse. The people fighting these advancements were the real ones holding back progress in our space program. And I knew that ultimately that would become known. It's just inevitable. You aren't going to continue to get the amounts of taxpayer dollars to send a handful of astronauts into space when there are ways to get there for less. And it just took longer than we hoped. And setting up the policies to make that happen, those ideas had come decades before as well. Doing things that we ended up using successfully, like advanced purchase agreements, called them anchor tenancy, doing demonstration missions for technologies. Those were tried and true methods that we knew were the best path. So I didn't react as well as I could have. And I also get asked a lot, would you do things differently? Of course. I'm not, in my view, a thin-skinned person, and I don't try, I tried not to be, but it was pretty frustrating. And at times I let that show. Part of that is also strategy. Like, are you kidding me? I'd be talking to astronauts. Are you kidding me? Like, this isn't about your single flight. This is about a bigger movement and a bigger purpose. And our space program is at its best when it has a larger purpose. It did in Apollo. And that's why we attracted the attention of the world and the funds. And we had lost a purpose. And what I have always appreciated about the movement, and the Space Frontier Foundation really embodies this, is the greater purpose. And as a political science and economics person, that's what government investment is for. It's not for a couple people to take joyrides and be on orbit and say, I'm having so much fun. Oh, how nice for you.
Yeah. If you had a time machine and you could go back and speak to one of your younger selves and said, okay, in the future, the two superpowers, one of them will be selling commercial seats to access space, and the other one won't have the ability to put humans in space. Would you or anyone at the time have bet on the actual way that played out? Like, was that even a concept? Like, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, like, was that something that had even crossed your minds? Or when did it cross your mind that this was a threat?
The collapse of the Soviet Union is again, so many things evolved from that. And in the late 80s, when some of these space development concepts were being formed, this is why folks went to Russia and things like MirCorp. I myself trained in Russia through MirCorp to go to space on a Soyuz. So pretty early on, I probably would have guessed that this would be the case. Knowing the NASA and aerospace folks as I did, working closely with them, being friends with them, didn't really make you think, oh, these are groups of people that really care about the bigger picture and getting the costs down. It continues to be a community that is largely based on their own financial security and advancement. And that's not a winner over the long term. And I was so impressed the first time I went to Russia. I went when I was at NASA in the 1990s at what they were able to accomplish with so little. And it's just overwhelming what they had been able to do. So being at
So
NASA when we
scarcity.
embraced that program was exciting. And of course, these last few years been very disheartening to see them take
Yeah.
their steps toward back to totalitarianism. And we really, I think, in the space program are trying to hang on to the space leadership that they held for so many years, but it is waning.
So that scarcity in the former Soviet countries was in some ways a driver of innovation. They had to come up with things, whereas our well-funded US groups didn't have the same driving condition from a
Yeah, I mean it's a little more complicated, but their tech, for instance, was just robust. And
Yep.
so instead of, at least if you separate out their little hiatus into the Buran and so forth, the Soyuz worked so well through brute force and repetition. And of course, a labor force that isn't making a living wage. So
Right.
these are not sustainable
No.
either, or something that we should be emulating.
And I would say we should be careful that our space startups don't believe that they can live forever on ramen either. But that's some lessons we should carry, both good and bad. So you talked about withstanding criticism and attack. Were there times where it wasn't person versus person, but just you versus the universe, where things just didn't seem to be going the way that your mental model of the world was, and you actually thought about cashing in and going and doing something else with your life? Because I will tell you, I've faced that existential crisis in this industry, and I know other people do as well. I'm not, if you didn't, don't don't have to make it up. But like, were there times of like, yeah, this might be the right answer, but I still don't know if I can be the one to keep doing it?
Well, I did end up leaving NASA in 2013, and that certainly had something to do with it. But before that, I really did not ever feel like giving in. It felt like we always had a team of people. Again, I came from the community that stood with me the entire time. And I always tried to make it out to the Space Frontier Foundation and NSS conferences and so forth, because I would say, you give me strength. But within the Beltway, the big lobbyists, the astronauts, most of NASA's leadership, they were vehemently opposed and tried to attack me personally. I share some of this in the book. I hadn't put it in the book, and my deputy said when she read it, "You didn't put in the dog poop. Don't you remember someone sent you dog shit once?" I'm like, "Oh, I blocked that." Is just like unbelievable. But in a weird way, it was empowering. I didn't grow up thinking I was going to be deputy of NASA. I came to this in a very strange background way. As I said, receptionist, secretary, bookkeeper at the Space Society. You wouldn't necessarily think that would happen, and without a science or engineering background. But other than the times I had children at home at the time, and I was scared. I did get death threats, and I remember not wanting to be near the front of the house at night with open, window shades and so forth, and the kids to be protected. That's not a good feeling, but it sure didn't make me want to quit. It
I,
really didn't. It's
right.
just not in my personality. Leaving for me was somewhat about, I've run this as far as it's going to be helpful for the program, and other people can take it farther, because I had become, a negative, a lightning rod. And certainly it I wasn't looking for a job. A headhunter reached out to me and said, people really want to recruit you because they are wanting a game changer and they see this. And I, working for somebody who really doesn't agree with you is tough. And I wanted the
Yeah.
Obama administration to be stronger. They did agree with me, but there's so much on the plate of a president. Again, this is something I tried to describe in the book. I really just didn't get, I think, once they made the wonderful decision to run at this policy, they just weren't willing to stand behind it with the political trade-offs that they needed to. They folded. I say in the book, we had, in my view, royal flush. They had a pair of twos, and we walked away from the table. I mean, why would you do that? But we did it because we needed the votes on healthcare, and because Bill Nelson got up every day, and still does, probably, thinking about space and what he wants to do. And he had decided he needed to make an agreement with Republicans to do the big rocket, to get Senator Shelby and Senator Hutchinson on board and do Orion. And that was the deal he wanted to make. And he was in a more powerful position than me.
So, okay, so that's definitely dark. I'm going to pull us maybe a little bit up out of that. And the community that was supporting you, maybe can you give a little bit more of a context of what did that actually mean? So for people that are brand new in the industry, they may not quite know what that community is. And even some of us that were not there then, but have come in afterwards, we've got different ideas of what was that community? You mentioned the conferences, but how did that express itself? What was the actual communication between you and other members of the community?
So part of it is coming from organizations, and in my case, the National Space Society, formerly L5 and NSI, where there were 30,000 members and very smart leaders who I knew had recognized and taught me this was the only path. This was the very best path to creating a spacefaring civilization. And the whole point of exploring space beyond its immediate uses for us here on Earth is this spacefaring survival, going beyond our single planet. And these are concepts that I believe to my core because of the community. But in the practical day-to-day sense, it is having people to go out to dinner and drinks with at night and conspire about which members of Congress we need to get to. I call them my kitchen cabinet. At this point, the Commercial Spaceflight Federation were some of my closest allies and part of that community. We would strategize because I didn't have my NASA team that was necessarily all going to be on board doing that. There would be editorials. At one point, Outsiders got a letter signed by retired astronauts saying this was the right path. Asking questions when others were speaking about it. There's always, we do have to be responsive to the public, and the voice that is given because of the space movement was very, very important. I was not only speaking to the industry that was making money off these contracts, but people were coming to these events and asking good questions, and even just seeing people in the audience when you needed to, nodding and coming up afterwards and giving you a hug and whispering in your ear, "You got this, we're with you." That meant a lot.
Okay, I'm going to replay that one real quick. Even if when you get off stage, there's always a line of people that want to come over and they want to tell you that they love you, or they want to pitch their idea to you or whatever. But one of the things that was particularly valuable to you was those people that would just come by and give you a nod or would catch you afterwards and just say, keep it up, well done.
Well, and of course, I mean, I knew them, and I could also get them assigned to things. Something that, gosh, it's overlooked a lot, but the Augustine Committee we came in with, and they were absolutely a critical step in getting this policy, because here were these, top of their field people who acknowledged that commercial space was the way to transport astronauts in the future. And when Dr. Sally Ride told me they had all agreed to that, I knew that one of the people who was absolutely critical in making that happen was Jeff Grayson. Well, Jeff, we had gotten appointed to the committee. I knew I could get one. I had shot to get one person that was not from, the typical traditional bureaucracy. And he was just the perfect person. He was technical, he was credible, and he made his arguments in a way that others could see them. Like, these are all really important people along the way. And having Jeff there as the Augustine Committee is briefing, and you're looking at him and you're knowing we are in sync on this, those are really important moments. And the last thing you want to do is leave people like that hanging. I was representing, it was, there's so many analogies that are funny, but, not many people who've grown up with these communities get to a role like that. Scott Pace is another one. And Scott and I have talked about these things. Scott also came from the National Space Society. He didn't take as much as I did, I guess, from the commercial elements, because I thought sort of went to the dark side a bit when in the policy world. But we all know what he really believes, and everybody has a master, and he had worked for Mike Griffin, who felt that the government needs its own systems. Hey, it's an argument to have. Yeah. It's a debate. Honest people can disagree. So yeah, I really could have written whole chapters on the support from the movement. And I do know that a lot of times they had taken hits and been maligned, but they'd also recruited people like Newt Gingrich as a freshman congressman, who he believed in everything we believed in. There was George Brown, the Democrat leader of the Science Committee back in the 80s, sponsored the Space Settlement Act. These weren't nothing. They didn't amount to much on their own, but over time, they built up to a point where when I was in there, enough, again, they tilled the soil, planted the seeds, been watered, fertilized, and we're starting to grow.
And so that community, and this is, I think, a real critical thing for people today to understand, is there were a lot of, it wasn't a single institution that took on this mantle and said, let's do it. It was individuals, not companies, individuals that were really driving this change, and a loose collaboration. Mostly, it sounds like it was, if it's dinners and things like that, it's understanding, it's a real politic, I guess, right? Like,
yeah, very loose, other than once I was appointed to lead the transition team, I was able to select a small team. George Whitesides, most notably, who had been executive director of the National Space Society after me, he and I got to work right away before even the election. It's all secret then, and if your candidate doesn't win, it's never announced. But early on, we had done the work, written this up, we're ready with what we wanted to propose, and I was working the transition team on the larger side. The Obama team was led by Tom Wheeler, for instance. He ran all the science and technology agency transition teams, and he was easy to convince of this. He has background, he became the chair of the FCC. So commercial things, working with the private sector, these were all very easy concepts, and recognizing that you want to leverage the government's investment. So having a combination of insiders like that within the Obama political leadership helped as well.
Is that untowards or unseemly, or somehow, because there some people have a framework that says, oh, you're wall and you're not supposed to talk to people. And I obviously don't have that opinion, but did you find that there were people in government service that thought it was a bad thing to talk to people outside the building?
There might have been some,
Okay.
but it's again sort of in my background, like I'm very well versed on the fact that you're there representing the people. It would be
Yeah.
weird not to talk to them. And I'm a big believer in no one person can know
Yeah.
everything. And the secret shouldn't be any secret. It's all about people. You bring together smart people and listen to them and take those ideas forward. That's all I did. That's all I did. And finding the smart people who can take them the next step. And for people in your workforce, being able to fuel them with, the support they need to take those ideas further. Where my challenge came was when there were people who just nonsensically, to me, didn't want to follow the guidance we were given by the administration when we were part of the administration. That's what's unseemly, frankly.
Yeah.
Looking to the outside is the whole point. I considered my jobs when I have been in government just a huge responsibility to represent the public, and the non-vested interest public is probably going to give you better advice on this than those who stand to make a buck off a certain way you're going. So I really felt like I was getting criticized for doing something unseemly by the people who were actually doing things that were unseemly. Many people who fought very hard for these parts of Constellation to be reestablished went then from government and worked for industry for clearly probably twice as much as they were making in government. That is unseemly.
And I asked the question mainly to tease out for folks who will get a chance to maybe listen to this and be aware that how our current state of the industry was formed was not through just RFIs and responding to SBIRs and things like that. There is much more to it, and your ability to communicate and exchange ideas and working with that community is one of the things that enabled you and all the other people to be successful. Newer entrants into this industry may not have that same idea and may believe that it has to be more formal. So,
there comes a time when it does have to be more formal.
Yes.
And once RFIs and RFPs and things are presented, there are legitimate rules that I more than followed because I believe very strongly, when everybody's against you, they're going to use any little thing possible against you. So we couldn't make any missteps.
Yeah.
And I know I upset some of my friends who worked in these companies. For instance, when we had the competition over Pad 39A and SpaceX and Blue were both bidding, and I'd had friends, I think, on the Blue side calling, and I couldn't return the call and didn't talk to them until it was over, and they were furious. Like, no, you didn't want me to do that. You wouldn't have wanted me to call you. And we're friends. Yeah, we're friends, but you also work there, and I'm not on the source selection committee. So yeah, it's not technically illegal, but it's not a good look.
No. Yeah. Absolutely. Tell me, a lot of enthusiasts in this industry, how did you navigate and choose to engage with maybe some of the more extreme crazies in our fine industry? Like, and I mean that because all of us at some point might be that crazy, but like, how did you figure out where to place your time and which crazies did you talk to?
I would guess that my level on the crazy scale modified over time. I learned to embrace the crazy. I have learned to embrace the crazy over time. I think early on, of course, you're early in your career, although I was very much enchanted with the L5 Society's energy and intellectual integrity. Sure, some of those advocates maybe weren't the most presentable in a Washington party circuit. One of my friends at NASA actually referred to me throughout my time at NASA as Wendy. So Wendy is a reference, I think, maybe it's Marilyn, to like the normal looking character in the Munsters or the Addams family,
Okay, yeah.
and all the other family are like monsters, but they treat her like, oh, you poor girl, you look so plain. And but I fit in with the outside world. So I was a crazy who could jump the
Pants.
shark and
Yeah.
work at NASA and work for the and fit in. You know, I spoke traditional aerospace. I had a space policy degree and could go to parties. And but the truth is, I think crazy is something that it's just not a real problem. You have people who are very smart with excellent views, and we shouldn't discount anybody over how we think they might present themselves. So I get the question, and I really feel like there is certainly a libertarian element in the
Okay, good.
L5 society. And so I was working in Washington, D.C. my whole career. So of course that is viewed as an outsider, like, oh, you know, they don't even want government. Well, I grew up in Michigan with a Republican family who believed very much in limited government. And that wasn't, to me, that radical of an idea. And of course, the government was never going to pay for us to create a spacefaring civilization. We had to find an economic pull, a driver, a market for these things in order to lower the costs. Those are all things that maybe it takes some level of an eccentric person to really make happen.
Yep. The whole moving the Overton window of what's allowed to be discussed. Let me poke a few other quick things here. I know our time is limited. Where did the movement go too far or overplay their hand or risk becoming complacent through wins? Or like, is there anything that you see right now that's like, okay, here were things where we might have over exaggerated or we risk going too far?
Again, that probably shifts over time. There were people who thought, why would we get so involved in something like the Moon Treaty argument? Well, that was important, and the people who did it should be, and I'm sure are, proud of that. We, in our testimony over those early years in the 80s and 90s, again, I have reviewed it, so thoughtful. And I can say this because I was usually delivering it, but I didn't necessarily write it. People who did that, like Scott Pace, Mark Hopkins, who recently passed away, Glenn Reynolds, who's Instapundit now, you know, these were sound ideas. Newt Gingrich was somebody who liked to give the most radical approach. And so that was maybe sometimes just because it was him later on seen as an outlier and something to push back on. I don't think I think the pushback started being a bigger problem when we really started succeeding. And today, of course, we have the issue of the billionaires. And I think it's unfortunate that we are so often now tying space development to the billionaires because there is a natural backlash, some of it deserved, against them as individuals. And that's quite different than the companies that they formed, where we know there's thousands of people working to do good things. I think right now I'm somewhat not thrilled with the let's fight over which of these companies we like better. I'm known as someone who thought it was not a good public policy decision to build the SLS in Orion. I will stand by that because it was tens of billions of dollars for so long that took us off a path where we could have incentivized, I think, lowering the cost sooner of some of these things. But really to argue over which of the rockets is better, other than as a public policy decision, because that's long past, let's let economics sort this out. Let's let technical success work this out. I think that's fair, but I'm also somebody who's not super conflict averse, as you might guess, and so a little conflict, that's okay.
So I'll ask this as the last one. As we're talking about the Space Frontier Foundation, picking up the legacy of all of the work from L5 and NSS and you and all of these people that have moved us forward, what are some of the things? Okay, I'm sure there's some great high, well, we should be focused on these sort of economic programs, but what are the sort of things that would be the support for this industry, the the new version of the community that you drew upon, what are some things that you would recommend that we do now in order to build on the work that you've done?
I think there has been so much positive development in the area of organizations supporting space activities. And I don't even like to call it the space program because that's not really what it is. And so you get these groups like Space for Humanity. There's, of course, several Mars focused groups where the lawyers are looking at the treaties and regulatory environment. That's all really important and takes me back to a story I simply must tell for this show because I remember the conversation that Rick Tumlinson and I had when he decided to start the Space Frontier Foundation, and he was nervously telling me. So by now I'm the executive director of the National Space Society.
Ooh, okay.
Ooh, big time. And he was a board member, and really the merger, while it had taken place, the staff had merged, we had chapter leaders who were board members. There was still tension between the activist side and the more traditional side. And Rick really felt that we were not an activist enough organization. And that's, I think he can tell you in his own words, but as he relayed it to me, he felt it was time to start a more activist group. And he wasn't doing it to disavow NSS. And he wanted me to know that. And my reaction at the time, again, I remember the conversation was, I think that is a wonderful thing to do. Maybe a bit of it was, yeah, I'm trying to testify before Congress. I'm trying to keep NSS in these things. I was appointed to the NASA advisory board. Like, I'm trying to be Wendy or Marilyn or whatever that woman's name is. And that's fine to have more groups. We had often talked about, we wanted to be like the environmental movement. And I said, just think if like the Wildlife Federation didn't think we should have a Sierra Club. You don't get to do that. And by the way, they're stronger because they have hundreds, probably thousands of environmental groups. And the space movement, as we mature, can follow that model. I was never this, oh, we need to keep everybody. And groups have grown up around what used to be National Space Society was one of the first, starting in 74. Planetary Society came along later. The Space Foundation, I was at their conference a few months ago, and it's just amazing what's taken place, each with a niche. And my funny comment to Rick was, no, if we're like the environmental movement, you guys can be the Earth Firsters. I don't know if they're still around, but they were the ones sticking spikes in the trees to
Anarchist cookbook or something like that. Yeah, that was yeah.
And I probably didn't want to work for them at the time. I later maybe became more of a sparks in the trees girl, but spikes in the trees. But I think that was an absolutely positive development as we continued, and there have been so many. So I would say, in answer to your question, that path we're on is a good one. I do really think there needs to be more focus on sort of our laws and regulatory environment. Often technologies precede our ability to manage society within them, but we are there, and it is limiting. It is going to limit our advancement if we don't get some of those established. And that's where I think I have a bit more concern with the billionaires, because it causes different types of communities to say, wait, I don't want these individuals deciding what the space frontier is going to look like. And that's you can understand why there's that hesitancy. And in the beginning, when we were proposing things along the lines of how, we had moved west with, we had Lunar Purchase Act language and so forth, it was less controversial. But that's what we need now that we're going to be having these tools to go these places, is the ability to say to the public, oh, don't worry, we're not going to mess with these things to the extent we're going to hurt society. These are all things to help those of us who remain on Earth to help the environment here. I don't know a single space group that doesn't also have an environmental Earth-centric agenda. I think that's really positive, and I like seeing that within the Space Frontier Foundation, being adopted, as well as a focus on diversity, a focus on recognizing we don't all have to have a cookie cutter approach to this, and different people from different backgrounds are what make us stronger.
And that community, for me, as I came into the industry, Space Frontier Foundation was home. Like, there were plenty of other places that I went, but when I was at the conference or with other people from the foundation, it felt like, even though I wasn't a space guy, it felt like home to me. And it sounds like you had a similar sort of group that felt like home, that wasn't necessarily inside the Beltway, which is phenomenal. And hopefully we'll be able to keep doing that for more people to come.
Yeah, and it's just so important. I didn't grow up around DC. As I said, I grew up in Michigan, and I remember when I moved here after college, and my family said, keep in mind that really isn't where it all happens. And they urged me to continue to subscribe to things like the Detroit Free Press to see what real people care about. And I think that does ground you. And again, especially you're in government. When I was at the National Space Society, my constituency was those 30,000 members, each paying $30, and it was easy to represent them and their views. But when you work for NASA, it's really the public that has a much broader agenda. And so we had to do things that I felt would really benefit the public. And there's no question that what we do in space does, if it's done in a way that maximizes that, all the better.
Lori, thank you so much. To anyone who is watching this, make sure you read the book twice even, or you can even listen to it, because you read your own book. So thank you for doing that. So it actually was your own voice, which is phenomenal. Thank you for all that you've done and for the insight that you're providing for those of us who are trying to bring more folks into the right way of thinking about space.
Again, thank you for having me. It's good to be with you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, everyone, for being a part of this. I'm going to stop sharing that. Sean, thank you for being a part of this as well.
Absolutely.
We've got a pretty good audience. That's kind of nice. We'll talk about stats and kind of community stuff here in a second. What are your thoughts? And this can be 2 minutes or it can be 15 minutes. What do you want to do?
We can do the after show. No, I continue to learn things, and that's part of the thing that I love. And having that conversation with Lori helped me kind of put some more things in context, and understanding what life for her was like. And if you've, I think, read the book, and she talks an awful lot about the conflict that she found, but and some of the support that she had from her space pirates, and it was really kind of cool to hear some of the other personal read on how things went. And since obviously these are not scripted, there's a lot of things that Lori talks about that then come up in some of these other conversations, a different angle on some of the same stories, the same activity experienced from a different point of view.
Yeah, it was, I've been a fan of hers for a long time. I knew her back when she was, she talked about her receptionist days at the National Space Society. I don't know if I knew her then, but I think I knew her right after. I've known her for a long time, and it's just kind of amazing, kind of remarkable to me how she has climbed through the ranks of National Space Society, and then taken that expertise and knowledge and leaped over to the Obama administration. They had and this is not politics, folks. What I'm talking about is history. During the early days of the Obama campaign, Obama was going to cut he was going to cut NASA's budget by $5 billion. So it was going to take a $15 billion budget and bring it down to 10. And then was going to move that $5 billion surplus to the Department of Education. So it was going to take a $55 billion budget and make it $60 billion. So it would be at the noise level for the Department of Education and crush the NASA budget at the same time. And it was during the primary process, Hillary Clinton had bowed out and moved over. Clinton had a really strong space program. That's where Garver came from. That's where George Whitesides came from. And so they moved into the Obama camp. And this is pre the election. This is before the election. So Hillary Clinton had a really strong space program, and to watch Garver move from where she was to where she got to, pretty remarkable stuff. Pretty remarkable, and the idea of the commercial space sector then, it was so brand new. It's not fair to call it a space sector. So she took a lot of arrows, and you heard her, death threats and dog poop delivered to her front step.
Yeah.
That perseverance, that grit, the tenacity, the commitment, pretty remarkable. Pretty remarkable. What were some of your takeaways? Right. I mean, this is your program, Space Frontier Foundation's hosting the pioneers of commercial space. What are your takeaways from this?
I was a little bit surprised when she said, "Oh yeah, like it wasn't that weird a thing." Like I grew up and it wasn't that weird a thing. Like, it still seems like a weird thing, especially to me, the commercial space side of things, not because of political philosophy, but because when I got involved, commercial space was already was making progress, but definitely looked down upon by everyone that had any experience.
Right.
And I kind of expected her story to be, it's always been tough on the outside looking in, and that wasn't what she said. So that was not what I anticipated.
Yeah.
And it made me back up a notch. And that's, again, understanding what life was like at the time.
I would argue that it was such a fringe idea that nobody felt threatened by it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm still the weird space guy when I go out to meet people for the first time. I'm still the weird space guy in my own family. Right. But nobody questions the commercialization element of it anymore. Not to me.
Not maybe right now. And this is going to be one of so the series is intending to focus more on the 80s, 90s, anchoring around the 90s.
Right.
And because
the earliest days of the foundation.
Early days of the foundation. And, there is that piece that is in between. If there's up until the moon, and then there is the shuttle era, and now is this commercial era. And maybe I'm like grossly oversimplifying things, but the motivations of the individual actors, I think, may be different by different eras, either different by their upbringing, by the expectations that they grew up with. And this is going to be, it's going to be interesting to see how this thread plays out in some more of these conversations. There are far too many people that have stories to tell than we could fit into one limited series. But I'm really kind of interested in seeing where that trend line kind of goes from these conversations. So
excellent. Okay, we're going to wrap it. That's an hour. If you want to take 90 seconds as a commercial for the stuff that's coming up, and then with that, we're going to close out.
Yeah, coming up, we're going to get some stories about the founding of the organization, and about the low points too. We're gonna get some people that are going to share high aspirations meeting reality and how that plays out. Because look, that's part of the challenge, and how people find the strength to get through it. So there's good things coming out of that as well. It's not just all doom and gloom. But yeah, more stories to come. And if there are things that you caught or things that you didn't catch, you're like, oh, well, what was that thing? Send us a note and we'll see if we can get them picked up.
Yeah. And thanks. Shout out to Jumpsuit. The comment is, I loved escaping gravity and even knowed myself as an aspiring space pirate. Thank you for the inspiration. Thank you for joining our show, and come back every Tuesday, 5:00. We've got Space Frontier Foundation 3 times a month and Mars Society 1 time a month. And we love having y'all. Thank you. Have a great night. Bye-bye, y'all.